Recording in progress.
Hi, I'm John Paul, and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm really pleased to be continuing in conversations about trauma. You may have seen the previous conversation I had with Philippa Smethurst about her book, 20 Ways to Break Free from Trauma. And we talked about what trauma is there, and we were looking at some ways of moving through it as well. She focused quite a lot on kind of self-help, but of course there are psychotherapeutic treatments, and one of the gold standards really of that is something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today to talk to him more about that and himself and his career too, an incredibly experienced psychotherapist and EMDR specialist, Mark Brayne. Mark, thank you for coming on.
Good to be with you, Paul. John Paul? No. Good to be with you, John Paul.
So great. Thank you. I really appreciate you giving your time. I mean, actually, just before we started, you mentioned something you'd been doing just before this, which in the context of your career, actually, because a lot of people that watch the channel are either thinking of being therapists or they're training to be therapists. So it's always interesting to hear, I think, people's career up until the point that they trained and also why they chose to become therapists too. So, of course, we're going to talk about trauma and EMDR particularly, but it would be interesting, I think, just to hear a bit about, if you're happy to do that, what your career was like up until the point at which you decided to train and what made you decide to train as well.
Well, we could talk for several days about this, but
45 minutes.
You catch me on a Friday afternoon in London, having come down from where I live in North Norfolk, where I grew up, come back there much later in life and now in my mid-70s. And I've literally just come from an interview with a bunch of filmmakers, documentary makers, who are putting together a documentary about the visit to China in April 1985 of the pop group Wham, George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley, as they were then Wham. And I had just started for 3.5 years in Beijing as the BBC radio correspondent there. So I was at the concert and covered it for the BBC.
Yeah.
And we've had a delightful morning reminiscing about George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley being the very first Western pop band to appear in China and what that meant for the process of China opening up and the politics and so on. So I've definitely been immersed in my previous career.
Fantastic.
Today.
Did you meet them then at the time?
I did. I interviewed. I was obviously at the press conference and so on. I was only 34 at the time because I'm 74.
Yeah.
And I did a 20-minute interview or so, maybe it was a bit shorter, with George Michael, age 21 at that time. He was only 21. And an exceptionally intelligent, lovely young man who had, a lot of tragedy and trauma in his life continuing on. And his life ended very early around drugs and so on. But he was an extraordinarily talented young man. And I've just been talking actually in the interview, I don't know how much of this they're going to use, about how he might have been experiencing himself in the world at 21, extremely mature, very balanced, a really interesting and good young man. But he was old before his time. His childhood was very probably complex, shall we say. I don't know about his childhood, but so I was actually talking in the interview about trauma, if you like, formative experiences.
Interesting.
But they probably won't use those bits because they were a little bit personal.
Okay. But, we would love to hear that about trauma. So you were a broadcaster journalist and then found your way through to becoming a therapist. How did that come about?
That's right. As brief as I can make it, I studied languages at university, German and Russian. So I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, in the then Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Germany. So I was pretty fluent in these two languages. And I joined Reuters in 1973. Had 5 years with Reuters in Moscow and East Berlin. And then I switched to the BBC, to BBC Radio. And I was then in West Berlin, Vienna, Beijing for 3 years, and then covered the end of the Cold War. And as diplomatic correspondent for the BBC World Service. And as part of my duties and my journey as diplomatic correspondent, I covered Tiananmen Square, the student protests and the violence in May and June 1989, and then the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe at a distance mostly. But then in Romania, I went into Romania at the last minute and was there for the fall of Ceausescu and the execution of Ceausescu and at the end of the last main communist regime in Eastern Europe. It was a liberating experience, John Paul.
Hmm.
The long story short, I was married at the time to my German wife who I'd met in Moscow. We had three children,
Nice.
and midlife, without going into too much details, should we say there was a moment of romantic encounter in on my way out of Bucharest, and interestingly, uh, I actually fell in love with a very much younger Hungarian girl on the train between Bucharest and Budapest.
Okay.
It was an anima journey. Now,
Hmm.
you and I trained at the CCPE, where we really worked deep with dreams and symbols and so on.
Hmm.
But only afterwards did I look back and realize that, in a sense, this was my journey of emotional completion, or at least journey towards emotional completion. And falling in love with a very much younger girl was sort of par for the course at midlife emotional crisis.
Okay.
So this is now approaching 40 years ago. No, 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And one thing led to another. My marriage fell apart. I'm remarried to my first wife again now, very successfully.
Okay. I didn't
So,
realize that
and
you remarried the first.
she is
Okay.
also a CCPE graduate. So we went
Mm.
on quite a journey together. We
Mhm.
journeyed together, apart, discovered, worked on psychotherapy, trained as psychotherapists. I left frontline journalism and then eventually left the BBC as well to become a full-time psychotherapist in 2003 at the age of 53. And my
Okay.
then ex-wife, my now wife, and my previous wife, all a bit complicated, graduated from the CCP in transpersonal psychotherapy 3 or 4 years later. And
Hmm.
we both then discovered separately EMDR,
Hmm.
which just switched the lights on, gave us this extraordinary tool to make a difference. And
Yeah.
it was at an EMDR conferences that we kept meeting. And again, one thing led to another. And I said, well, should we give it another go? So she said
Wow.
yes.
Yeah.
She said yes, John Paul, on the top of Machu. She said yes on the top of Machu Picchu in Peru.
Gosh, there is so
Best
much to look
not.
at there, isn't there? Wow. Okay. So, and you run
So
your business with her now, is that right? Do you?
yes, so
Yeah.
I'm actually in the process of retiring. You catch me literally just a couple of months before retiring at Easter
Oh,
when I hit
wow.
75. And
Mm.
I'm going to go on a very, very long bicycle trip to Budapest, because I'm learning Hungarian as well. Never stop changing, never stop learning. So
Cool.
I studied languages, became a journalist, then became an editor, retrained in my spare time through the 90s as a psychotherapist, as a
Mhm.
transpersonal psychotherapist.
Mhm.
Left the BBC, set up the DART Centre for Journalism and Trauma, which was in Europe, which was an organization specifically educating journalists on the coverage of trauma and also the experience of trauma. So support, workplace
Okay.
support for being exposed to very nasty stories on a regular basis.
Okay.
And then in 2008, I moved on from the Dart Center and discovered a deeper way of working with EMDR, which we came to call attachment informed EMDR,
Mhm.
where we go into the roots of our clients' formative experiences, not just trauma.
Mhm.
It's absolutely fascinating how, if you go deep, the difference you can make to people's experience of the present by getting in and actually rewiring the literal stories of their formative past is, I don't wear socks, John Paul, because they get blown off all the time.
Okay.
I jest, I do wear socks, but my socks, my
No
socks
judgment,
are,
no judgment, Mark.
I could be sandals, with beards and knitting my own yogurt. No, the power of EMDR, of
Yeah.
attachment informed EMDR, to change people's lives in the present and the future is quite breathtaking.
I think it's why I'm so glad we're talking about it for people to hear that as well that aren't familiar with it. Just going back a little bit to why you chose to go into trauma, was it because of seeing traumatic things and perhaps experiencing that yourself as far as your work, the journalism work? I only say that because you mentioned Tiananmen Square, and I mentioned in the intro talking to a therapist called Philippa Smethurst, and she became a therapist after she was a teacher in China, and she was there during Tiananmen Square. So it was in response to that she then retrained to become a therapist, actually, supporting the children who were in her class about what was happening there. And I just wondered, and as you mentioned it coincidentally, is that why you found your way through to trauma, because of the career and what your own experience?
It's a good question, and how interesting that you've been just talking to somebody who was on Tiananmen Square. I had the extraordinary journalistic foresight to leave Beijing 5 days before the tanks went in, so I missed the big story. But in a sense, I think in many ways I got the bigger story, which was 2 or 3 weeks earlier, when the whole of Beijing basically was out on the streets, having a kind of cathartic release, emotional release, after decades, if you like, centuries of Chinese containment. I won't call it suppression or repression, but the Chinese collective psychology is to really understand individuals as primarily members of a bigger group. China doesn't do individuality, and it's now been learning to do it. And in a sense, Tiananmen Square was an explosion of a desire, like a midlife crisis, a national midlife crisis, which was shut down by the parents. It was a kind of emotional tantrum, if you like, which needs to be responded to with kindness and intelligence, containment, but support. The Chinese authorities weren't able to do that at the time. But in a sense, what I took from that was not my exposure to seeing nasty things or reporting nasty things. It's much more complex and rich than that, because in a sense, I was carrying unconsciously the traumatic imprint of a childhood, my own and my parents, and the intergenerational, ricocheting down through the generations of stories that aren't necessarily about external trauma, in fact, aren't really primarily about external trauma, but about the the impact on the survival-informed nervous system of dysfunctional external attachment. So both my parents, John Paul, were born in India in the 1920s of colonial families. So both my grandfathers were senior Indian civil servants. That's how my mother and father met in 1945. And their childhood, basically, they were orphans. In the British colonial system, childcare was all outsourced. So children would be sent off to boarding school, they'd be raised by nannies, by nurses. My father, sent to boarding school at 6 in 1927, couldn't even speak English. He was a white, British civil servant child. And his first language was Urdu, because he was brought up basically by the staff. So to say that my mother and father didn't have a clue about how to be parents is to put it very gently, very gently. So my childhood, as I've come to understand it, was attachment, what's the word, sort of emotionally unintelligent. So if you think of emotional intelligence, both my parents hadn't a clue. And also, John Paul, at 70, very late in life, I had myself diagnosed as autistic. Very high functioning, would have been called Asperger's before it was all put together in DSM-5. So my childhood, looking back, there wasn't anything terribly nasty that happened in a big T trauma sense. But I was an incredibly unhappy little child. And clients that we work with in the English tradition, certainly in many traditions, have pretty miserable or complex childhoods where there's unfinished business. And fundamentally, I think a successful psychotherapy is to close the gestalts, to repair the wounds, the unfinished business of dysfunctional childhoods that may not necessarily have been horribly traumatic on the outside. There might have been a privileged background. You and I work with people from quite privileged backgrounds. These days you and I are white, Anglo-Saxon, cisgender or whatever, and all of the rest of it. We are privileged. But our childhoods, in many cases, have attachment compromises in there, where our parents are carrying dysfunctions from way back. And actually, people are the way they are. And this is such a big statement I'm going to make. They're not the way they are because of the trauma that they experienced. People, when they come into psychotherapy, are the way they are because of how their nervous system learned to deal with dysfunctional experience. How did their nervous systems get programmed? from the moment of conception. In the womb for 9 months, the quality of the birth, the dance with mother, the maternal attachment, the dance of the family system, siblings, and there are trillions of moments because that's how fast the brain works as it's layering up a sense of who I am, who the world is, laying down the basic rules of being in the world.
Some people that are listening will be familiar with what's involved in the model EMDR and how it works. Could you just say a bit about that for people that aren't aware, and what's attachment based has added to it?
Okay. Well, the basic EMDR, the standard protocol, the standard protocol as put together by Shapiro in 1988 or so. The classic founding myth, if you like, of EMDR is that Francine Shapiro was doing a doctoral research. She's a cognitive therapist. She was a cognitive therapist. She's now died. And she was taking a walk in the park area, in the Bay Area in San Francisco. All good things come from San Francisco, or the American West Coast. And she had a cancer diagnosis and she was feeling, a lot of pain or distress. And she noticed at one point that her eyes were moving left and right. I'm not quite sure, we're just looking at things. And the distress had abated. And so she tried again to choose to move her eyes, and it had the same effect on the distress. She said to her friends and colleagues, "Can you try this thing?" They did the same, and it had the same effect on their distress. So they found it difficult to do it spontaneously. So she suggested, just follow my fingers, do it like this.
Yeah.
And that's how the basic EMDR was invented. And Shapiro came from an NLP cognitive therapy background. So she pulled in hypnosis and she pulled lots of bits and pieces together and created this thing called the standard protocol with its 8 phases, where you do a history taking, you prepare, you introduce the idea of bilateral stimulation, this left, right, sounds or eye movements or physical sensory taps. As it's developed over the years, it's clear that it's the bilateral stimulation that does it, not just the eyes. In fact, you can do very good EMDR without any eye movements at all. She then tested it out with colleagues and it worked. She did some research and got some published and created a model and then trained some people in the model. Bit of a Ponzi scheme, to be honest, So it was the central people, then they went out and trained others. And so you had this kind of pyramid scheme. The thing that got stuck about EMDR is that because Shapiro had done this initial research that proved that it worked with Vietnam vets in 3 sessions, she, as the originator and the controller, if you like, the guru of EMDR, was extremely reluctant to allow any form of reform.
Right.
And she was actually very rigid in this. You've got the 8 phases, just to quickly summarize. It goes Harry Potter and Dumbledore in big cheesy relationship. H for history taking, P for preparation, Harry Potter, and A for assessment, which is finding the target that you're going to work on, the specific moment you're going to work on, traumatic moment, unpacking it, the cognitions, the physical sensations, and the emotion, and applying bilateral stimulation in phase 4, desensitization. Phase 5, there's a positive comes out, you install that, it's called installation. Then you've got the body scan, you check the body. It's very much an embodied therapy as well. And you have closure and reevaluation. So those are the 8 phases. And that's a fundamental structure that really works. But the problem with the EMDR over the years has been that the standard protocol is excellent with big, nasty trauma like a car crash, a tsunami, a rape, where you have a memory that is burning, a PTSD flashback style.
Yes, because that's the way it works, isn't it? You have to have a memory in that situation with the protocol that you work on, holding that particular memory and the effect that it's having on your body as well at the time. Yeah,
that's right. So the standard protocol with a specific memory, let's say a rape or parental divorce in childhood, some big story that sits in there and it's big and it hurts a lot still. And you unpack it in phase 3 with what's your negative belief about yourself when you think of that event? What's the picture that represents the worst part of it? My first one, the very first target I ever worked on, was being at primary school and walking across a road, a pedestrian crossing at the time that my parents were divorcing. So, that's quite deep, but it was a
Yeah.
particular moment on the way in, as it were.
Mm.
And the question that our therapist asks is, when you think of that moment, what are the words that go with that express your negative belief about yourself now? So it's resonating on. And with me, it was shame. It was I'm not good enough. I'm sort of not safe in the world. A big generic statement. What would you rather believe about yourself?
Mhm.
I'm okay. I'm safe. I'm a good enough person. How
Mhm.
true does that feel on a scale of 1 to 7? This is a very Shapiro thing. So 1 is not true at all. 7 is absolutely true. In my case, it would have been about a 2, the alternative belief. And then the therapist asks, you go back to the negative cognition and the picture. What are you feeling?
Mhm.
Shame or sadness or anger or grief? And how strong is that on a 0 to 10? Where 0 is neutral and 10 is off the scale. You're really feeling it intensely. And then where you're feeling it in your body, and then you do the bilateral stimulation in bursts of about 30 seconds. That's the standard protocol.
Yeah.
Basically, in phase 4, desensitization, you hope for the best.
Mhm.
Basically, that's how standard protocol works. I mean, that's a very harsh way of putting it, but you trust that what Shapiro called the adaptive information processing, AIP, capacity of the human nervous system will kick in. Because just as if you cut yourself or break a leg or a bone, if you're well looked after, appropriately looked after, that wound will heal because that's what evolution does. That's what the body does.
Mhm.
The analogy is that on the emotional front too, on the nervous system front, if you've got an emotional wound, if you clean it out, it will heal.
Mhm.
We don't heal as therapists. We facilitate, we clear the obstacles for the client's body, their evolutionary self and body, to do the healing. We don't heal our clients ever. They heal themselves, but they've got stuck. They're looping. And
Mhm.
EMDR breaks that vicious cycle. Now, the problem with Shapiro is that standard protocol wasn't allowed to evolve for very, very many years. It's still running. It's a big political issue still.
Mm.
10 years, after 10 years of using EMDR, standard EMDR, very successfully, increasingly successfully as I got the hang, as I discovered this attachment focused way of working,
Mhm.
it's a simplified and modified protocol. And it uses the present much more explicitly to target, discover, identify the formative stories in the past that need reprocessing.
Okay.
So I mean, it's actually much more simple once you get the hang of it than it sounds. In fact, the attachment informed way of working is simpler than the standard protocol. So in
Mhm.
phase 3 of the 8-phase protocol, which we still use, the questions are not NC, PC, VOC, emotion, SUDS, body, this big long thing where you ricochet the client between left and right brain.
Mhm.
It's what's the image that represents the worst part of it? What are you
Okay.
feeling? What are you feeling? Where are you feeling it in your body? And what's the belief about yourself?
Mhm.
Go. Much tighter. Also, in attachment informed EMDR, we use the present to bridge into the past. I could
Mhm.
show you how it works if you like. If you'd like to just experiment, you needn't tell
Mhm.
us too
Could
much
do.
detail, should we?
Yeah, yeah.
And the thing about the attachment informed approach is it bypasses the left brain. The left
Mhm.
brain has a big narrative about self. It has memory, explicit memory as well. The right brain has explicit memory. But somebody might come into into therapy and say, I'm being horribly bullied at work, or I had terrible anorexia or ME in my teens. Now, what's the deeper story? You asked what's distinctive about, EMDR
Mm.
and the attachment informed way of working. Maybe shall I just do a little exercise with you to
Let's give that a
briefly?
go. Let's do it. Yeah, come on. Depending on
So,
how it goes, it will stay in or it won't. That's
okay, right. But it is so powerful because you can identify with a client almost straight away. I mean, you have to do it with care because
Mm.
you can blow the fuses on their survival systems. You can take away their defenses
Sure.
in one go. You don't want to do that until they're ready to put something better in their place.
Yeah.
So the way I identify, I mean, I get a sense, client comes in and you ask them questions about their life. You get a sense of their, you do a formulation, you do a history taking. In some forms of psychotherapy, you don't do that, but definitely in a trauma-informed way of working,
Yeah.
you want to know what's happened. You want to know a bit about their childhood. You want to know about big things that have happened in their lives, hospital stays, violence that they might have experienced, stories that they've been exposed to. You want to know about their parents. What was their parental relationship like? Siblings? How was the family system? Just the basic details. A little bit about their journey to wherever they are now when they come to you.
Hmm.
But then to work out what are we going to work with? And the distinctive thing, which I haven't mentioned yet really about EMDR, the really distinctive thing that makes EMDR different from any other therapy I've ever learned, two things. One is targeting,
Hmm.
which is to find a specific moment anchored in space and time, like a 125th of a second photograph of a particular moment, firing it up the level of emotion, body, belief, and then applying bilateral stimulation,
Hmm.
left brain, right brain. Incoming sensory information signals to the brain. Classic is the eye movement across the eye, the center line, which is like REM sleep.
Hmm.
So the eyes move like in REM sleep, or with sensory tapping of the knees, or holding a buzzer, or working online with headphones.
Yep.
And basically, EMDR is to fire up those specific moments, apply bilateral stimulation,
Hmm.
and it works.
Hmm.
It just works. Not always, but if you have a good understanding of what it is that you're targeting
Yeah.
and why, EMDR is massively more effective,
Mm.
in my experience.
Because there's no interpretation by the therapist, is there? It's just whatever happens, happens, and then what? And it continues, doesn't it? The bilateral stimulation. So, I mean, it may be that your way something different happens, but the original protocol isn't necessarily that the therapist would direct or interpret.
That's right.
Mm.
In the standard protocol way of using EMDR, really you get the story, you target it in those realms, dimensions of cognitions, emotions, and what the body's doing,
Mhm.
apply the bilateral stimulation, and then get out the way.
Mm.
And basically, you return to target. So you let it run until there's a positive or until there's a kind of neutral point, and then you come back to the target
Mhm.
in the hope and expectation that that target won't feel quite so distressing anymore.
Sure.
And classically, it can work really, really well if you've
Yeah.
got a client who's able to do it.
Mm.
But when you're working with complex developmental experience of
Mm.
attachment,
Mm.
trauma, putting it in inverted commas, it's much more complex than that. It's
Mhm.
actually, funnily enough, simpler because underneath the story is how the nervous system learned to deal with stuff. Life is full of stuff. People talk about big T and small t, big T trauma, small t trauma. There was a
Mm.
Shapiro phrase that she introduced fairly early on in the EMDR journey. John Paul, I talk about L, big L and small L. And guess what L stands for?
Mm.
Life.
Ah, okay. I was going to say love, but it probably wouldn't in the
No,
context of trauma. Yeah,
life. You know,
life. Okay.
the thing is, life is difficult, as Scott
Mm.
Peck says. I mean, that's the basic truth of the Buddhist understanding. Life is, if you like, suffering. But no,
Mm.
stuff happens, big and small. That, as you're a little tiny infant, you've got a
Yes.
full nappy, or you're cold, or you're hungry, or there's a noise and you don't know what it is. You're frightened it might be a bunch of hyenas outside,
Mm.
200,000 years ago who want you for lunch.
Well, because there's also, and I wondered with attachment focused EMDR as well, there's also something which it's often big T, small t things that have happened, but there's also too little for too long, isn't there? That sort of neglect side, which is perhaps
It's
more around attachment too, that there just wasn't the presence well, I say love, that to internalize for someone. So we're left with fear and impulses, really, without being able to coping somehow, but not being able to internalize the thing through healthy attachment. I would see it much more, and I don't know what you think about that, but also the absence of something for people throughout their life, which is very difficult to notice or can be.
I talk about in because I do a lot, I've been doing a lot of workshops in this over the years. I talk about the presence of dysfunctional experience
Mm.
and the absence of necessary functional experience.
Right. That,
Because
yeah,
the
yeah.
because the infant,
Mm.
just a little bit about evolution, and then I'll do a bridge with you just to show
Okay.
you how we get in there, how we bypass all the clutter of thinking and get
Mm.
right into the story. It's
Mm.
incredibly powerful and actually quite easy. And you can
Mm.
use this technique, by the way, in any form of psychotherapy.
Mm.
Um, the evolutionary dynamic that's going on, we must always be aware and remember that the human infant is born incredibly early in the developmental cycle.
Mm.
Because we walk upright, we're not like other mammals working on all fours. The infant has to get out before it's too big, and certainly long before it's able to look after itself or run or do anything that's necessary for survival. So, as Gabor Mate often points out, who's really worth following on all of these things, the Canada-based physician who's written some wonderful stuff on this. Um, the the human infant is the most vulnerable, the least capable of looking after itself of any creature on the planet at the
Sure.
point of birth.
Mhm.
That is an extraordinary statement, and for the longest period. So the infant has to attach to mother. It's a bit like a limpet crustacean. If it isn't attached to a ship's bottom or a rock, it dies
Mhm.
because it has to be attached to be able to filter nutrients out of the water. We die without attachment. I just end up, I mean, without attachment, we die.
Yep.
And so the infant is programmed by evolution to lock on to mother, primarily to mother, because it's really mainly about maternal attachment, even when you're working with same-sex parents or adoption or fostering or whatever. Those first 9 months and the actual birth are incredibly important. And the nervous system learns moment by moment through the developmental journey how to deal with stuff that's happening.
Mhm.
Um, so the big stuff that happens on the outside is a useful way in to find out what the nervous system is up to. But let me just do a little bridge with you, John Paul. Are you ready?
Yeah.
You needn't say very much, or you can reveal as much as you feel comfortable revealing on your podcast.
Okay.
So I just invite you to close your eyes. In fact, don't say anything at the moment. And you to talk about it. It's very quick. Close your eyes and bring your awareness to an experience in your life at the moment that is not so good. And it's an old friend. This is a familiar place to me. I get triggered by this. I get activated by that. And I feel, run ragged by a particular experience. Have you got one?
Yeah.
Something. Just run the video of that and pause the video, the recording of a recent moment like that.
Mhm.
That's present in your life.
Mhm.
And notice what picture, image captures the intensity, the most intense moment of that experience. Have you got one?
Mhm.
When you look at that picture, when you connect with that image, notice what you're feeling, what emotion you're feeling right now. You got one?
Yep.
And where that emotion is or would be happening in your body.
Mhm.
And notice the belief about that, all of that that goes with that experience. It's very often something like, I'm not quite good enough, I'm not safe.
Mhm.
Have you got one?
Yeah.
Connecting with that thought about yourself, that sort of belief, that core belief. Connecting with the picture and the emotion and what's happening in your body. Now drop back in time, go back as far as you can, first place you land,
Mhm.
way back. Okay, have you got one?
Yes.
Okay, so open your eyes. How old
Mhm.
are you?
I would say probably three.
7? 3, right.
Young.
3,
Yeah.
even earlier.
Mm.
John Paul, you're in.
Mhm.
You're in. What I would do now, and can you feel the emotion right now? It looks a
It
bit as if you
changed a
can
little
actually.
bit, but I could while I was thinking about it. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
That's our way into your developmental story because you've gone there, wherever it is, for a reason. The
Mm.
nervous system knows where to take us. It is astonishingly clever.
Mm.
And it's a right brain limbic system cleverness. And we park the left brain and say, can you just stand back for a moment? You observe what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how accurately it will take us into to the client's developmental journey. I would then start processing that, as we
Mm.
say in EMDR. I would find the picture that we started in, and I
Yeah.
would ask you the same thing, image, emotion, body, belief, and then apply bilateral stimulation for
Hmm.
about 30 seconds, a couple of bursts. You would very probably begin to get the story. You'd tell me the story.
Hmm.
You'd begin to tell me the story of little John Paul. You don't interpret in EMDR,
Hmm.
but what you do is very much guide,
Sure.
but and then stay out of the way, and then you're sort of negotiating your way through. And the metaphor that I use, John Paul, is for listeners and viewers who know the movie Back to the Future,
Yeah.
the wonderful DeLorean time traveling machine with its
Mm.
flux capacitor power system. Basically, the metaphor is that you, the therapist, are the driver because you know how it works,
Mhm.
and your client is your passenger and your navigator.
Mm.
They're the Marty McFly. Their system knows where to take us, and we crash into your childhood, age 3,
Mm. And it's so
and the
interesting
job.
how quickly you go with a current memory to something there. I mean, it would have immediately, it would be a memory that's often somewhere around, but that they're associated somehow together is so interesting, isn't it? Decades, not that many
Yeah.
decades apart.
Um, I I did an extraordinary piece of work, a very emotionally cathartic piece of work with Laurel Parnell in New York
Mm.
in 2015, where I was aged then 65 nearly, and I was being very badly triggered. I was in extreme distress to do with the politics of the EMDR Association.
Mm.
We didn't go into the details because I was being autistic and a bit of a revolutionary, I was pushing the boundaries.
Sure.
And authorities don't like people who push the boundaries. So I was having a miserable time.
Mhm.
And it was activating my shame-based survival responses to being autistic in childhood. Now, I didn't know at that point that I actually could qualify as with a formal diagnosis of autism. But with Laura Parnell, I bridged from the present distress, image, emotion, body, belief. And I
Mhm.
went back to being 7. We often go back to 7, very often,
Mm.
on the playground at my primary school,
Mhm.
being bullied, being called Lucy. Now, a boy in 1957 Norfolk being called Lucy by other boys on the playground is really bad news. That's big trauma, actually,
Sure.
really humiliating.
Mhm.
And I've talked about that at the CCP in therapy till the cows have multiply come home.
Okay.
But the shame was still running. I
Mm.
still had a kind of shame-based response to self in the world.
Mm.
And I said to Laurel, because I went back to this 7-year-old memory of being called Lucy, and I said to Laurel Parnell, oh God, I've done this so often. I've talked about this till the cows come home in therapy. She said, stay with it. Stay
Mhm.
with it. We started the tappers, image, emotion, body, belief.
Mhm.
And within about 15 seconds, I was sobbing my heart out.
Mm.
All of the accumulated grief from nearly 60 years that
Mhm.
had never been able to be metabolized, including a huge amount of therapy,
Mhm.
in the training. It finally metabolized. And so I finally was able to let go in that one session,
Mhm.
massive tears, of the shame of what the reason I held the shame for so many years was not because I was called Lucy on the playground. It was because at home, my mother probably autistic as well, hopeless at, child rearing.
Mm.
I never told anybody.
Sure. Yeah, and I do remember it's really important, isn't it? Somebody saying about things that are often more traumatizing as well if you go through them alone. To the
Yeah,
ability to go through with someone, even if
yes.
seemingly very traumatizing events. I think there is that thing of being alone with it, isn't there?
Well, not just,
Yeah.
it's absolutely central, John Paul, because
Mhm.
we are creatures, in evolutionary terms, we are creatures of attachment.
Yeah.
Without attachment, we die. So when we have experience, we
Mm.
have to be able to, as a child, our frontal cortex cannot soothe us. We
Mm.
don't have a frontal cortex till we're
Mm.
7, basically.
Mm. Mm.
So we need mother to regulate our affect, to regulate our emotion. We
Sure.
gradually learn how to do it. But if the presence of mother is compromised by her unfinished emotional business, so that she's either overly anxious, overly angry, or shut down or absent in some way,
Mm.
we have experiences that don't metabolize. So they get locked in the system.
Mm.
So they're still looping. So, even with you, with your whatever it was we bridged from in the here and now,
Mhm.
hello, old friend. We all have stuff that's unfinished from the past. Of course we do. The goal of therapy is to get somebody to a point where the balance is reasonably okay.
Yeah, to enable to, lead a pretty healthy and have good relationships. Good enough, I suppose. Yeah.
Right.
When you're talking about bilateral stimulation online as well, just from a practical point of view, when I did some EMDR, it was in front of someone with the fingers going
The
from side to
eyes.
side. What happens here? I mean, if we were going to go ahead with that memory that I had, how would you do that here? Is it with sounds or?
If we're working on Zoom,
Yeah,
we would do what we call the butterfly hug. So I'd
I.
get you to put your hands, palms facing you up like this. If you
Yeah.
just do this now, just so
Mhm.
we should, and you cross your thumbs like that.
Yeah.
Place the heel of your palms on your breastbone here on your sternum, so
Mhm.
you're tapping sort of on the collarbones,
Okay, I see.
and it's
This
left,
kind.
right, tap, 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 tap. We call
Yeah.
that the butterfly hug.
Okay.
And it's
Mhm.
brilliant. It works very well. But I use a different platform called bilateral base. There are several platforms, specifically EMDR
Mm.
dedicated. And I use one called bilateral base, which has a built-in capacity to generate tones, left,
Okay.
right, and to generate a bar, a dot that goes across the screen backwards and forwards, which gives you
Interesting.
your eye
Okay.
movements. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
You can even do buzzers, handheld physical buzzers that you post or the client orders, and they work on Bluetooth or stick into yeah, they work on Bluetooth. So you can actually start a physical tap, a physical sensation, a buzzing in each hand
Mhm.
remotely to to people with those buzzers anywhere in the world. It's very clever.
Amazing. Are you retiring shortly?
I turned 75 in April, and the thing about my developmental journey is that my survival response to childhood and life
Mm.
has been overachievement.
Okay.
Workaholism is the sort of technical term, is perhaps workaholism. So I
Mhm.
have burnt brightly all my life
Mhm.
in terms of journalism and constantly doing things.
Mhm.
Which is why my first and third wife divorced me first time round, because I just wasn't there, because I was constantly working.
Mhm.
So I have been a very busy EMDR therapist and a very busy EMDR provider of, further trainings and workshops and so on.
Sure.
And I've got two small grandchildren, but
Mhm.
I'm watching their developmental journey, and they live right now around the corner. And I can see the evolutionary purpose of grandparents big time
Right. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
into thinking attachment and secure attachment,
Yeah.
secure base, Winnicott,
Mhm.
and so on. And my wife and I need to be there, need to choose to be there for those little kids in
Wonderful.
ways that we
Yeah.
couldn't be there for our own kids. And
Mm.
therefore, therefore, these two boys' father, our firstborn. So we
Yeah.
can see all the things that we got wrong last time, and we
Okay.
want to get it right this time.
Yes. I mean, as you said,
And
the importance of mother, but generally a number of different attachment figures, I think, as well, isn't it, for children growing up?
I really do emphasize mother.
Mm.
And I do get a certain amount of pushback saying, that's blaming mothers for children's uh, then adults' issues. The thing is, evolution, the process of mammalian evolution, we are all born of a mother. And our
Mhm.
nervous system is primarily formed in the context, first of the physical experience of mother
Mhm.
during pregnancy and breastfeeding and so on, then her whole presence, odor, tone of voice, softness or hardness. Virtually every child on the planet is fundamentally formed in that dance with mother. This is not a nice to have, it's deeply evolutionary.
Mhm.
So I do enormously focus on the maternal attachment, but the rest of it matters enormously.
And unfortunately, I guess when the nurturing's not there and who was meant to be protective is potentially the problem or a problem, then we're into trauma, aren't we? Yeah. Oh, it's been so amazing to hear all about it. And there's so much more, I guess, we could talk about. I mean, the theory, the practice of it all. I mean, there are lots of people, as I say, who are looking to come into the profession generally. But what would you say to people, a bit of advice about somebody coming into the profession, wanting to become a therapist?
That's a good question. I'll answer it sort of sideways. I get a lot of requests for therapy,
Hmm.
not just to me, but to the community that I've built, to attachment informed therapists. So I have a find a therapist page on my website if people are interested in this, listeners are
Yeah.
interested in this, emdrfocus.com. If somebody's interested in attachment informed EMDR, then EMDR Focus Find a Therapist is a good place to start.
Right.
Um, I think that somebody was asking for therapy the other day, and they sent a note saying, "Please, can I have a psychotherapist? I do not want a psychiatrist."
Hmm.
They were very clear.
Hmm.
They wanted to work with somebody who's done the work themselves.
Hmm.
So you can do a quick counseling diploma in 2 years.
Hmm.
There's plenty of short trainings out there. If somebody wants to really be a good therapist, I would encourage a pretty decent, deep course that involves personal development, not just the theory, and also a lot of personal therapy and a lot of client work.
Hmm.
At the CCPE, we had to have 150 hours of our personal therapy when I was doing it. I think it's now 170 with clinical placements and things.
Yep.
And you had to have 650 hours of client work.
Hmm.
And that's in 4 years. So by the time you hit 4 years, 5 years, having done maybe a basic, mine was 5 years, mine was 5.5 years,
Hmm.
having done the fundamentals, the introduction to counseling, and then 4 years of diploma, then the MA, completing the MA at the end. By the time you're done, you've done 6 years. In some
Hmm.
places, you do even longer.
Yep.
There's no quick journey to be a good psychotherapist.
Mm.
If listeners to this podcast are interested in becoming therapists themselves, go for a course that's accredited with the UKCP would be my basic suggestion.
Okay. Hmm.
Integrative as well. I wouldn't recommend psychodynamic. Sorry, I just wouldn't.
Okay.
These days it's too narrow. I would go for integrative, transpersonal, gestalt.
Hmm.
Those that all roads lead to the top of the same mountain. Ultimately, all roads lead to Rome. But
Mm.
uh, a transpersonal training, an integrative, especially transpersonal training with EMDR bolted onto the top, you can work with anything.
Mm. Because it's interesting you said that about the sort of length of time as well, because there's quite a few people that would contact because of financial reasons. They want to, because the transition can be difficult financially, can't it, for people from a relatively high paying career, for example, to setting up a private practice. So they want to do it as quickly as possible. So there's often a time pressure. So how long it will take and how much it will cost do tend to be the most common questions for people. But so it's interesting you saying that about the necessity really of that depth of the sort of length of time and the depth of work in the training. I'll often say that there's a reason why I think UKCP's accredited courses are all part-time over 4 years. And there's a reason why that is.
Absolutely. I think ultimately, how effective and good you're going to be as a therapist is
Mm.
really a reflection of how deep you've been able to go in yourself. You're not going to be complete as a
Sure.
person by the time you
Mm.
finish your training. I mean, I finished my basic training 25 years ago,
Mm.
and I look back at the Mark Brayne that aged 50 with my MA, and now 25 years on, I look at myself at that time and think, oh my God, you thought you knew what you're doing.
Mm.
Flipping heck, you know.
Well,
It
I
gets
would
deeper
often
and
say
deeper.
that totally. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about it. It's a wonderful thing, but it's also that one of the misconceptions I probably would have had is that once the training's finished, I'm therefore that's it. You're ready with a body of knowledge to go out there. But it's the constant development of things as well, isn't it? There will be things that I found very helpful and sort of light bulb moments that happened 10 years after I qualified. It was enough to be able to do it back then and be a good enough therapist, I would say, back then. But it's certainly an ongoing process and will continue to be, I think, which is one of the great things about it as well.
I think therapy is much less a profession than a calling and a way of life. It
Sure.
becomes
Yeah.
fundamentally who you are.
Mm. Would you
And
recommend it as a profession then, generally for people thinking about it?
I can think of no more rewarding profession.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
breathtaking being able, when you're able to meet people at depth and to make a difference. I mean, don't come into psychotherapy because you want to heal people.
Mhm.
That won't work. The fundamental best driver to become a psychotherapist is because I want to sort myself out. Once I've
Mhm.
sorted myself out, at least I've got an idea of how I'm going to
Sure.
do this.
Mm.
Then you can share the journey with others. Not that you bring your own story into it. I probably do, in my case, probably tell my clients too much about myself. But fundamentally, there's a very good quote from a colleague of mine in the EMDR world, Mark Brayne, who describes it like this: the builder has his tools, the painter has his brushes, the mechanic has his spanner, and the psychotherapist has his self. It
Mm.
is the relationship
Yeah.
ultimately that heals. But you bring yourself, but it's a very good idea to have some cracking good tools
Sure.
in your toolkit.
And if people want to get in touch and find out more about it, you did mention the website. If you could just say that, I mean, I'll put details below the video of any kind of social media links and the website too. But you'd suggest people go to your website to have
Well,
a look.
I've got an essay, as it were, on my website.
Mm.
There's brainwork.com, Brayne work.com is my therapy website, which is pretty much being put into aspic at the moment because of the retirement.
Right.
The training website, the EMDR training website, it's called emdrfocus.com. And there is a fairly long piece there, about 3,000 words, on what is attachment informed EMDR.
Mhm.
And there are worse places to start.
Very good place to start, I imagine. But so yeah, anybody watching who's interested, please do go and take a look at that. Mark, we could have gone on for hours, I'm sure. Even 45 minutes talking about why I'm in China would have been fascinating, I imagine.
Yeah,
But thank you
absolutely.
so much for your time and
Well,
all of your wealth of experience. I think people are going to find it so interesting.
well, it's lovely to
Really
see you
appreciate
again,
it.
John Paul, and
Yeah, you too. You
thank you
too.
for the invitation to do this.
That's okay. That's okay. Yes, and I'll put details below of the ways people can contact. And thanks again. And yeah, you take care.